Please welcome back director Morgan Neville. Of course.
Thank you. What a great turnout. Thank you, thank you. I see some familiar faces, friends, so thank you, everybody.
Well,
I always just have to say, because Roger knows, I grew up in Santa Barbara. You know?
I mentioned that when I introduced
so coming back here, coming to this theater, I remember seeing movies here in this theater. All the time, it was more revival movies.
But when you were here, there were rats and
it was part of the charm. Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome back. When I introduced the film, yes, I mentioned you grew up here. I also mentioned that there were 3 levels to this film, visual narratives. There is the actual the interviews. There is you show us the narrative in what they're telling us, their stories in animation, but also then there's the third where the creativity, the fantasy world. Tell us about navigating those 3 narratives.
Part of it was, starting this film, the origin of the film is it's pretty close to what you see in the film, which is the first time I met Pharrell. He said, "I love your films. I had an idea that you could make a documentary about my life. And when you were done with it, you would throw away the visuals and do it again in Lego." I mean, he said that to me right up front. And at that moment, I said, I kind of love that idea. Like, I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's possible. But I love the ambition of it. And then we talked about why Lego, and there are lots of reasons in his life, not just in terms of his childhood and his kids. He has 4 kids, my life, but then the kind of the metaphor of it and the creation of it, which is like building a song and building a movie and building a life and all the kinds of things that. So I got really excited about it, but then I had to go talk to Lego and say, how do you feel about doing a hip-hop musical documentary in Lego? And they said in that first meeting, we kind of love this idea, but we don't know what it is either. And so then we had to figure out, is this actually going to work? So I did a little kind of 90-second a demo, as much for myself as for everybody else, to say, is this actually going to work? And it was the scene where he goes to listen to Stevie Wonder on the radio as a boy. And that's when the synesthesia kicks in. And that scene has all these different gears, all the different gears. It has a kind of a documentary gear, which is like very real life, almost like you feel like you're in a documentary from the camera work. And there are a lot of very one-to-one translations of shots. Then there's kind of the cinematic memory gear, and then there's the fantasy gear. And the music unlocks, the rules I made for myself, the music unlocks the fantasy. So when there's music, which there's a lot of music, it kind of, anything goes in terms of the visual storytelling. And we finished this video, and I think everybody that saw it just said, I want to see whatever that movie is, I want to see it. Kind of proved to all of us that we were on to something.
There's so much that I need to latch on to the things you mentioned. The Lego, that works as a metaphor. The fact that, what I got when I was watching the film at Telluride was that, the Lego is a metaphor to, building. Did you immediately understood where he was coming from?
Well, not immediately, but quickly. I think, it was something, that started. There were so many different things that started to click, as it were, that from the idea of how he saw making music to kind of layering and assembling pieces, and the idea of the beats then being a visual thing and the synesthesia, but then this kind of bigger metaphor of kind of how much agency we have over our own creative lives, and kind of the freedom to create that you would have in a Lego set. And in a way now, I can't imagine this film existing in any other universe other than the one it's in, because to me it's all inextricable at this point.
When I introduced the film, I told them that in the documentary world aspect, you actually incorporated mistakes. Well, so-called mistakes. I mean, we see booms, things that we normally see in a documentary. Why did you have to incorporate that?
I mean, it was interesting because, I made the film twice. We assembled everything in the beginning. We had the interviews. A lot of the interviews I just did on Zoom, early days of COVID, so they weren't in person. And then we got archive footage. Then, I filmed things. We went back to Virginia Beach, and I filmed some of those interviews were filmed with his parents and his wife and with Pharrell. And then, music videos. And then I hired a kid out of art school to just draw things in the edit bay. Just like, okay, I have the idea that this would be a kind of underwater scene, so let's just start to do some basic storyboards, just to kind of fill up the edit, just so we could screen it for people and kind of sit back and say, is this working structurally? And I also stuck a lot of movie clips in, tons of different movie clips, because I wanted different scenes to just have an idea in your head of what the feel of that scene might be. And it was, everything from...
Moonlight?
What's that?
Moonlight?
Moonlight was a big one. Definitely the Pusha T scene when he's running, that to me, Moonlight was a big influence in terms of the color and everything else. But, everything else from Harold Ahmad to Yellow Submarine to...
That's actually one of the things I've always admired about your documentaries, is that you're so knowledgeable about film. And you're making a documentary, but I still see the reverberations of cinema at large.
I mean, I've been a film geek my whole life too, which is great. And you don't always get to, play with those influences to the same level. So there are lots of shots in this movie. I mean, for instance, the scene where his grandmother's sick and he's driving and he gets to the hospital, that's based on the end of Harold Ahmad. The scene where, Bud Cort's driving and she's in the hospital, it's cutting back and forth, and you just see him getting the news from the doctor through the glass.
Yeah.
And so being able to play with those things, having that much freedom in animation, even if nobody till right now even knows what that reference is, or that was something that was just great to to have that kind of control.
But I've seen the film a few times, and I was just fascinated by the fact that when you think of animation, there's a freedom of creating, and then the way that we know documentaries, you're restricted by the fact that you cannot. You're capturing what's happening. So I was just wondering, from your vantage point, the friction.
Yeah, well, this is what's interesting. So then once we finished this Frankenstein cut, and I took it to the animators, and we met up at the main animation studio, Pure Imagination, Howard Baker, who was my main animation director, and a lot of other people helping on design and everything else. What I quickly realized is how animators see film and how documentarians see film is exactly the opposite from one another. Because in animation, the director's God. You get to control everything. You get to decide what every wall is colored like. And in documentary, you're lucky if somebody hands you a sandwich. You have no control. And you learn to kind of embrace the lack of control in doc. You don't always get to decide where to put the camera. You don't always get to nail the focus. You don't always, get to control all these things. And we had in the beginning, just a lot of them saying, well, we don't do that in animation. And me saying, great, well, we're gonna do it now. So a lot of the handheld work and rough handheld work. And right from the first shot of the film, I kind of wanted to announce in a big way, this is not what you're used to in terms of animation. This kind of rough, him walking around the kitchen and the kids are yelling and he's trying to get quiet and go in for the interview. But what was interesting is I think the animators became way more attuned to my way of thinking, and I became way more attuned to their way of thinking. So So the friction between those two I thought was really interesting. I didn't want to let go of that. I mean, there was even one shot I put in there that there's a thing I've seen in archive footage a lot that I've even used where, like in Roadrunner, the Anthony Bourdain film I made, there was a guy that used to follow Tony around at the beginning.
Correct, yeah.
And he would always have the camera running, and he would ask him a question and then wait for the answer. So the beginning of every question was pointing at his feet, because the camera's just rolling on his feet. And he's like, so what do you think of this? And they go like that. So there's the question where Chad's in the studio, and I was like, I want to see the camera looking at the feet of the Lego cameraman shooting, and then whip up, when he's ready for the answer.
Yeah.
Just things like that were, some of that was just for me, but that keeping that randomness of documentary. And there are things in there like, there's the shot of them in the back seat where they're just laughing and having a good time. And that is exactly a shot that exists in the real world. But it's the kind of shot you couldn't conjure otherwise if it didn't exist. Or when Pharrell's speaking at the end and the crow starts interrupting him. That happened while we were filming. You would never think to have a crow interrupt, but it's that kind of thing about documentary, the accidents of documentary that I love, that I didn't want to iron out.
You're telling me so much, and I have so many follow-up questions to so much that you're telling me. One of the aspects of the film that I found enthralling was the fact that you could have created a completely fantastical world. Instead, you animate, it's like very specific and it's true to life, like, when he goes to his high school, et cetera. Tell us about the necessity to make it, grounded in reality.
Well, it's interesting because even in the beginning when we started talking about production designing the film, typically there are lots of things you would normally do in an animated movie. You would really come up with a kind of an overall cohesive look for everything, and the film would feel like it was made out of one piece of cloth. We wanted the opposite. We wanted the documentary approach, which is it's a pastiche. It's a quilted blanket of all these different things stitched together, and it's not uniform. And in that way, then when we started working with our design teams, we really encouraged them to start to bring whatever they brought to that set or that scene early on, just to start to use that difference to play like in the real world. And a lot of times, a lot of those locations, it wasn't, let's invent an idealized, a crazy version of something that exists. It was like, well, let's just try and recreate what this thing is, So, his high school looks exactly like that. We went and scouted and took pictures of all these locations. The Atlantis housing projects that he grew up in look exactly like the set. So there's part of that was great, just the literalness of it. But it's interesting, like Teddy's studio, Future Records, the exterior looks exactly like that building. And the building has since burned down and it's gone and I couldn't see it, but from the pictures. But there were very few pictures inside. And the way then that Pharrell, the kind of, what's going on inside that studio next to his high school, the idea that, well, let's just embrace that it's this magical place, so let it be subjective. It is more of an imagined, heightened version of what this young boy saw Teddy's studio like on the inside. So the inside of that studio is this really kind of amazing location. So, for me, having that power to be jumping from objective to subjective design and, storytelling was just a blast,
When you interview, and we hear the interviewees talk about their recollections, et cetera, I don't recall ever hearing a documentary where what they say is so descriptive.
Yeah.
And, okay.
So everything in there, with the exception of the first conversation that Pharrell and I have in the film, everything is just documentary audio, with one or two exceptions. So that first conversation, I didn't record the moment I met Pharrell, and we talked about the idea. But then later on, I said, can we just have a conversation and kind of recreate a version of our first conversation and just improvise it and kind of pitch me again what you want the film to be, and we played with that. But everything else, including dialogue that people say in the film, is every line in there is something that somebody said or something that somebody said. So we didn't script anything. It was all, so even if Pharrell went and revoiced a line, it was a line that somebody else had said, Pharrell had said to them. And the one thing that I did differently in this film than I would normally do in a documentary is if somebody was starting to tell a story that I felt was important in some way, I would really drill down into getting microscopic in the detail of that moment.
And why?
Yeah, because I wanted, I'd say, so what did you say to them at that point, and how did they respond, and how did you feel in that moment, and what did you do? Were you standing? Were you sitting? Just really trying to get them to paint pictures because I knew that would help me paint pictures in the animation.
Okay.
And certain people speak like that naturally, like somebody like Nori, who I didn't really know, is kind of built for animation, the way he talks and the way he's describing things. And then even, what was so liberating and interesting is, a line like Busta Rhymes has a line where he says, there are these should, woulda, couldas in your career. They come in at a certain point, and when you're not doing well, they'll get in their lifeboats with their life jackets and they'll abandon you. Mm-hmm. And that one line led to that entire scene in the film. But it was just an offhanded line that Busta Rhymes happened to say in an interview. And so it's kind of being able to take what the real things people say and then just stretch them and kind of visualize and use them as, a basis for a metaphor and taking it from there. So
did they know when you were interviewing them that they were going to be in Lego form and it was going to be animated?
We didn't tell anybody it was going to be in Lego. We told, and again, a lot of these were during the pandemic on the phone or on Zoom.
And why didn't you tell them?
And we just said, we're going to do a movie. It's a documentary, and we're going to animate it. That's all we said. We didn't tell them for a couple of reasons. One, this is now almost 5 years ago, and we just didn't want the word to get out too much. But also, I didn't want people thinking too self-consciously about how they're going to come off on screen. I just wanted them to be in the conversation we were having, kind of being inside their own heads. And sometimes if you start planting those seeds, it can kind of affect people's performance, I guess. And I wasn't looking for performance. I was looking for, authenticity. So that was
Did they have a say down the road about when they were going to be animated?
Only a few people, who are big stars said,
But you only have big stars in this film.
But there were maybe 5 who said, we just want to see what we're going to look like before it's done. And so we sent them all like a little 3D render file of their minifig character. And I have to say, I was a little nervous, but they all loved it. I think Missy had a note or two about what she's wearing. And actually, I think Missy is one of the coolest characters in the film. She has these earrings, which you don't, like actual earrings, which don't really exist. So we had to make the earrings as part of the hair. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole, there's a whole other rabbit hole to go in terms of
Actually,
Lego
I was going to ask
So-
you the fact that you have the complexions. It's not something we've ever seen in Lego. You have different, darker shades of skin.
Yeah.
You also, the hairdos is something that we've never seen before. The specificity you talked about, Missy's earrings.
Yeah.
Was that over?
Well, so Lego has kind of rules for what Lego movie style is. This kind of based on a stop motion, even though it's a 3D render. But that everything in the film is buildable. And they want everything in the film to be, so right now the film is 99+% pieces that you can go out and buy and build. And everything in the film is built or buildable. And the only new piece, there were a lot of pieces we kind of, Carl Sagan's turtleneck, There was no such thing as a turtleneck in Lego, but there was a clerical collar, which we could turn around backwards and turn into a turtleneck. You know, things like that.
What about the complexion?
So then the main things we pushed them on were skin tone and hair. And to their total credit, in the beginning, they said, we know we have one color to represent, you know, black skin, and that's not good enough. So we spent a lot of time talking about complexion and going through, and I think we used 7 different complexions of black skin in the film. And now Lego knew they needed to have this conversation. The dreadlocks, the braids, you know, I remember like Pusha T's braids. We sent them a design, and they said, the braids are too narrow and they'll break off and a child could choke. We said, but it's just a movie. They said, but it has to be manufacturable. So then we ended up actually talking to the Lego designers in Denmark to say, how thick would the braid have to be, and can you help us design the braids so they pass the Lego test? But out of this, Lego's now manufacturing new skin tones, which is awesome. I mean, they knew they needed
It's
to
about
go on this
time.
journey. Yeah.
That's awesome. Nitpicking, but like I mean, I'm a huge fan of Lego movies. I've seen every, you know, the Lego movie and Batman, et cetera, et cetera. When they have an outfit, it's just one outfit. But in your film, Pharrell, I lost count. It's like over 50.
And more than 80. Pharrell has more than 80 different outfits in this film, which is not what you normally do in a Lego movie. Normally, you know, because Lego figures can be hard to recognize, and they, you know, they wear one outfit for the whole movie.
Yeah, for the whole movie.
And they're shot differently too. I mean, they're shot typically in wide shots, and you know, and so there were a lot of things that we did differently that I wasn't sure were going to work. You know, Pharrell, of course, is a fashion guy, an icon. So there was no way he was going to wear one pair of clothes for the whole movie. But once we said, okay, can we follow the characters, particularly Pharrell, through these costume changes, and kind of figured it out. We're like, okay, I think it's working. And then the other big thing was, you know, some of the emotion of the film, saying, okay, if we're going to be doing a close-up on a minifig in an interview crying, and a minifig, again, you know, there's no nose, there are no ears, you're not allowed to animate tears or sweat or any of that. So it was like, is this going to hold emotionally? Like, is it going to work? You know, and we did a lot of tests on that, and it did work. I mean, to me, one of the comments I'm happiest about that I've gotten many times is people saying, "I forgot I was watching a Lego movie." Just that there is, I think, the emotion seems to carry through the medium of it, which is great. You know, that's exactly what we were hoping for.
Tell us about animating the synesthesia, which is the aspect that Pharrell talks about when he sees, when he hears music, he sees colors.
Yeah. I mean, that was a big thing. And again, I'd done a test with it in our first one, but it wasn't very elaborate. So Howard Baker, our animation director, contacted Michel Gagné, who's a famous animator, who had done the synesthesia in Ratatouille, and said, would you know, we have some synesthesia, we're trying to figure out how to animate. And he said, well, I've done synesthesia. And Howard said, but have you done it in Lego? And he said, no. And so he helped us develop that language for what synesthesia would look like using Lego pieces in the film. And that was, again, like one of these things that how often would you have a character who can see sound? And in a normal documentary, even a scripted film, you wouldn't really see that, you know. Mm-hmm. But in animation, it's completely natural to suddenly see those things. So that was just another one of those connections that just made it feel meant to be.
And the colors, there is such specificity to the colors. Did they come directly from Pharrell, that he told you, I see blues in this particular moment?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask Pharrell about any song, and he'll tell you what color it is, which is, if you're animating a movie, like, pretty great, you know? So every beat in there, too, you know, they're not just random shapes, that they were Pharrell. You know, we created a lot of beats and a lot of things we thought looked good. And then Pharrell would say, yeah, but this song really feels sharper and it's emerald, you know, not yellow. And so those beats all are authentic to how Pharrell sees them, even though there's nobody else in the world that knows how Pharrell sees them. Because synesthesia is different between every single person. People don't see the same colors. They all see different colors. So, I mean, but that was just one of those things, you know, and there were moments, you know, like in the scene with the Kendrick song, All Right at the End, where I said to him, you know, when you think about that song, what color do you see? And he started describing this kind of wave of blues and grays, and that became this kind of rainbow effect we have that takes us into the black and white. And that, you know, is again one of those gifts of like, okay, we can talk about what we're imagining, you know, and in that way, animation frees you too to kind of get, it's not just what you're seeing with your eye, it is what you're seeing with your mind's eye, you know, and that's having that kind of license, particularly with somebody who's such a kind of magical thinker as Pharrell, just felt like the perfect way to tell the story.
I'm glad you brought up the music and the songs, because in other documentaries, when you hear songs from, you know, a musician that is being covered, they're just there as background. There's a specificity to the way you use songs in this documentary, where they actually they become a storytelling, you know, signpost, you know.
I mean, that's a big part of my thing. You know, I've made music films for years, and in addition to being a film geek, I am a serious music geek.
You're just a geek.
I am. Well, thank you. But particularly like on a film like 20 Feet from Stardom, you know, really thinking about how to use. Thank you.
Academy Award winner.
But on that, I really set the mission of every song in here. It can't just be a good song. The song has to drive the story or drive character. And it's something I've never kind of wavered from, that every song has to tell a story. And so my process for at least since 20 Feet from Stardom, definitely on that film, and before, when I first start a film, I make playlists. You know, it used to be I'd make mixtapes or mix CDs. Now I just have Spotify playlists. And for a film like this, there was so much music that I made like 10 different playlists that were all produced by Pharrell, produced by the Neptunes, NERD, solo, influenced music. And for months, I would listen to the music and try and feel where I could hear a song that was communicating some of Pharrell's emotion, or was speaking metaphorically about something, or just felt like it would belong in an animated movie. And I just kept culling that down. So I had a kind of base group. And then there were a number of songs that, like God Bless Us All, which was a NERD track that Pharrell had written because he was giving advice to another singer friend of his. And I heard that, and Pharrell had told me so much about his pastor growing up, and I just thought the lyric of that song feels like what your pastor would have said to you, that kind of advice, you know, that Pharrell has channeled that advice now in the song years later, but then taking that song back into the context of him in church as a boy. And we took that song, it's based on Pharrell's original track. I took out Pharrell's vocal because I didn't want him singing to himself. And I got Charlie Wilson from the Gap Band to sing it. Wow. And then I dubbed on organ and choir onto Pharrell's track, and then put it in the film and animated to it. And when I completed the whole cut of the film, before I showed it to Pharrell, before we started animating, because I wanted him to write some new music for it. And his main reaction when he saw the cut was, you picked that song and that song? Like, it blew him away to hear his songs being used in such different contexts. And he was like, I just need to think about it. And the next day he called me and he's like, I think it's all perfect. But I think it just twisted his brain when he heard what I'd done with all this music and songs that, maybe and sooner or later, and songs that become big emotional moments in the film. I think he was just kind of surprised, because they're not necessarily big hits of his.
Correct.
They're just album tracks that I found that felt like they were driving the story.
Which leads me to the next question. That when I first saw the film, I got so emotional during the passage of Happy and your connection to Black Lives Matter. Can you tell us the genesis of that, how you arrived to that connection?
I mean, it was Pharrell talking about, which I hadn't really thought about, but the kind of the legacy, and sometimes the uncomfortable legacy of that song, a song that just seems so superficial in a way, and that he even thought of in the beginning. May is like, okay, you want a happy song? Here's a song called Happy. And how that song took on a life and started to mean things in people's lives. And then, as he says in the film, why do people gravitate towards that emotion so much? It's because they're not happy. It's because they need happiness. It's they're searching for happiness, and kind of seeing the reaction in people's lives at the same time that, this was, really even the beginning of Black Lives Matter, but kind of 2016, 15, 16, 17. And it kind of fed into it. We had a lot of discussion over how much do you show of Black Lives Matter, and kind of what was happening in a way that, and I know some people, we had a lot of discussion about it with a lot of people, including all of our other producers and consulting producers and everybody, because I said, is it okay to do Black Lives Matter in Lego? And the resounding answer was absolutely, that we don't want to paper over it, and not that we have to exploit it or shock kids who might see this film, but we don't want to ignore it, and in a way, putting it there and understanding that that's really the context that things like All Right came out of, and so much of what's informed since, that actually it's one of my favorite parts of the film. Now, I love that kind of emotional weight that just comes in the wake of Happy, and it's true to what Pharrell went through at that time.
If you don't know this beforehand, I'm one of your biggest geeky fans. You have always tapped into, from Mr. Rogers to Steve Martin to Bourdain, artists struggling to find their voice and honing their voice. How does Pharrell fit into that canon?
I mean, I feel like there are two things all my films are about. One of them is about how culture can unite us or divide us, and the other is about the magic of the creative process. And
which is rare to find, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's so rare for us in documentaries to capture the moment of creation. But in this film, you're able to tap into that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, I've filmed it at times. I mean, even, on a film like 20 Feet from Stardom, sometimes I was telling stories, but sometimes I could be there and see things happening. And I filmed lots of artists working and seeing it happen. And it always feels like a bit of a miracle when you see somebody who's incredibly talented have a breakthrough or do something, that's awe-inspiring. And so this film, I felt what was interesting about it is I felt like we could time travel. So, there could be a story somebody had about recording a song, but here, between how people talk about it and taking the song and taking it apart and listening to the voice of the person singing alone in a vocal booth years ago, suddenly we could be next to them in that moment, in a way that you couldn't do normally certainly in a documentary, of just feeling like you're right there at that moment of creation. And so that was endlessly fascinating for me. But I feel like this whole story is asking a lot of questions that Pharrell was asking, which are really the questions I was asking Pharrell, because they're questions I ask myself, which is, how do you hang on to your specialness, your idiosyncrasies, your, when the world tends to want to flatten you, the industry wants to flatten you,
or also when your specialness becomes the status quo.
Absolutely. Then what do you do? And when people just want you to then repeat that, how do you avoid those trappings? And I feel like I told Pharrell this when we started the film. I said, this film's going to be a bit like therapy for you, but I guarantee you it'll be therapy for me too. That we're going to talk about all these things because they're the things that to me resonate. And to me, it's great if you love Pharrell and his music, but I also feel like if you're just a creative person, I want the film to speak to you on that level, regardless of whether or not this is fiction or nonfiction.
Last question, I promise. I'm being told to wrap it up, but there's so much to dive in here. We're used to seeing biopics and documentaries that dive into, with creative people like Amy Winehouse and the drugs and the sex and the rock and roll, and I'm thinking of other, Let's Get Lost, Chet Baker. Yeah. You forgo all of that, and the thrust is the creativity and the demons of the artists and their voice, and which I find that the storyline, the crux, the conflict is about their person and their creativity, which is so refreshing.
I think there are kind of two reasons for that. One is early on, one of my mentors was a music writer who's still around, Peter Guralnick, who's an amazing music writer, and wrote those two big Elvis volumes, and was just somebody I loved his writing. And we became friends. And I remember him saying this to me 30 years ago when I was just a kid. The three least interesting things about musicians are sex, drugs, and getting ripped off by your record label, because everybody tells the same stories.
Yeah.
It's what is special about them beyond those things that you want to look at. And I've never forgotten that, because those stories are all the same stories. And in a way, looking back, I've actually made way more music films not about just artists, because artists tend to have very similar stories, but really about either the backup singers, the people on the margin of it, but really often about producers too, because producers have to have a bigger vision. They travel between worlds of artists. They almost always have a bigger philosophical view of the world that I find really interesting. And so in a way, I feel like getting into this, I'm both trying to produce them in a film and letting them produce me in my film. So it becomes a dialogue back and forth, because without a doubt, from the idea of Lego, Pharrell's producing some aspect of me, and I'm then producing back how I see his life and story.
You have progressively, I think back just recently, the Steve Martin documentary, where you challenge yourself and the medium, and now you've taken even further. Is that something that is essential for you to keep breaking the boundaries of what documentary and narrative is all about?
It keeps it interesting. I said to my wife last week, I said, I just realized I've been going through a Baroque period, so I definitely am interested. I've been doing that long enough that to me the idea of pushing the medium is so exciting, and knowing where I came from when I started documentary, where documentary was when I started documentary, which is back then it was the spinach of filmmaking. It was good for you, but nobody really wanted to eat it. So to see what has happened with nonfiction storytelling, to me, is incredibly exciting and rewarding. And so I feel like this film opened so many doors in my mind about what was possible that now I'm just excited to keep going through those doors.
And we're only the lucky beneficiaries of your search. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Morgan.
Thank you, everybody.
Please come back.
Yeah, will do.
Of course. Great. Oh, hug it out.